There you go. Okay, live on Facebook. Sorry,
Part
folks.
two.
Little problem with technology. We were just getting into the juiciest part, but apparently gave a little showcase for Davy's plants. I
I
know
didn't
that
know what
you're,
happened. So I'm like, here's a cannabis plant, and look how big that one is. They're really big.
but this is a part of your biography not a lot of people know about you is that you were like a really good, like grower of like plants, of cannabis plants, right? When you were like in your 20s or 30s?
Yeah, actually, I grew weed, and this is like when it was criminal, right? It was like against the law in Idaho with some hippie dude, and I grew weed with him. And that one summer, I made more money. I mean, it wasn't even that much money, but I made more money than I've ever made in like one go. And then I grew some again to pay for monk school. So I can go. That's how I paid my way to get to go become a monk. Is I grew a bunch of weed.
I love it how like your life has been alternative from the day one to like the end, and that's always how you've gone to success, you know? It's just doing your own way.
Hey, I will find a way. Survival, right?
You were in the middle of telling us something really good about how, there's a paradigm in whiteness too that's also learned, and you were
Yeah,
sort of getting into that piece.
yeah. And so, again, I'm still teasing this out, and I know that scholars have talked about this, but this is my own like view on it. It's like, I think where the frustration is with this whole conversation about racism for some people, and particularly for white people, it's like, we are all human and we are all
Yeah.
love. And at the core, it's like, when I'm with my husband who has white skin, it's just one heart and another. Like we're married because we have so much fucking fun together. We're like
Yeah.
10-year-olds. We have so much fun. Maybe a little bit older because 10-year-olds aren't having sex, but you know what I mean. We're kids together, right? We play and we have
Yeah.
fun, and we're just being human together. And that's what kids do. Kids just play together. And racism is learned behavior, right?
Yeah.
That's the thing. Just like
Yeah.
sexual shame is learned behavior, racism is learned behavior. It is
Yeah.
not encoded into the human design. And so, but what's important to understand is it is a state of consciousness. It is a paradigm.
Right.
It is a reality, and it is extremely harmful, traumatic, dehumanizing, violent, and abusive for
Hmm.
people who are on the receiving end of it,
Yeah.
particularly people who have been receiving it for fucking centuries,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that is why it's so important to identify and root out, because you don't want to walk around hurting people. You want to walk around loving people and connecting.
Exactly.
But we can't love and connect if we have this wall of pain between us. And if the way you are interacting with me is directly wounding me, like stabbing me,
Hmm. Yeah.
emotionally, psychologically, right? We can't, there's no union where there's harm being
Right.
caused. And so that's why it's so important to identify and address, so that we don't have to fucking hurt each other anymore.
Yeah.
And so there's this entire demic of people, descendants of slave, African descendants of slave in the United States, can finally have some fucking peace and justice.
Hmm.
There will be no peace with no justice.
Hmm.
And the path to justice is going to be really uncomfortable. It's
Hmm.
going to be very uncomfortable, particularly for people who have been infected with whiteness.
And probably people that are in positions of power that, things would get displaced because things need to change around, some people like having their situation that, they have, there's comfort in this money and this way of doing things, and they don't want it to be threatened.
And that's great when it isn't ill-gained, but the wealth disparity in the United States
Yeah.
is ill-gotten gain, right? So it's not like that, oh, work pull yourself up by your bootstraps and work. That's not accurate. That's does not take into context the whole history and the system and everything. So it's
Right.
important, if we actually do want equality in our system, if we actually do want equality and justice in our world, we're going to have to be willing to examine those places within ourselves that are invested and benefiting from injustice,
Mm-hmm.
and me included.
Mm-hmm.
There's systems of that I benefit from. I've got privileges that I benefit from, and it's heartbreaking when that shit's pointed out sometimes. I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
that's a bitter pill to swallow. But if my core desires, like I find that with the work that I do, it's such a privilege, the work that I do. It's such an honor because I get to like be present as one human with another human and just support this blossoming of human consciousness. Like it is such an honor and such a privilege. And when my blind spots are pointed out by some of my students, which they are sometimes, I'm like, oh, that hurts. And I love you.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I want to hear that need. I want to hear that need. And so what is all the other stuff, whatever, it's like, I may not agree with the strategy. I may not agree with the viewpoint, but the need, they're requesting, they're yearning, they're asking me to meet a need. And
Right.
that's what I respond to. I'm the need for love, the need for support, the need for inclusion, the need for acceptance, the need to be seen and heard.
Mm-hmm.
And that desire to meet each other's needs is part of the human design. That is part of the human blueprint. Hatred, racism is not part of the human blueprint, but that imperative to hear and see and connect with each other as beings, that is part of the human blueprint. And that gets damaged by trauma, whether it's racial trauma, directed towards Black people, or whether it's historical trauma that has somehow disconnected white people from their ability to feel compassion and empathy.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's two things that are coming kind of in my brain right now. One about that whole history where how the country of, let's say, the United States and North America as a whole and Europe became prosperous, and the sort of mythologies that are created around that identity. And it's almost like there's this need for an acknowledgement of like actually what really happened.
Fuck
And
yeah.
like changing the narrative and like having the real conversations in schools with children at all levels kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I'm also, and this might be a very poor example, but I don't know, when you were speaking, it just came into my mind. I went to this workshop once that was sort of, it was in the format of a bit of a, conscious kink kind of workshop. And you had to sort of touch the body of your partner looking for the no. And then when that person found the no, instead of being like, oh, I feel rejected, it was like, thank you. Thank you for showing me your boundary. And I can trust you now that you have told me what your boundary is. And like, we're kind of wired differently. We're like, as soon as we try things in the dark, and then when we get a no, we're like, oh, I did something terrible. And like, I feel uncomfortable with you now. And it kind of like switching the whole narrative around. And so it kind of told me like, you're giving that example of the people in your group or your courses being like, I want to give you this information or this feedback. And you're like, that's hurtful, but thank you.
Well, it's embarrassing because I'm like, shit, I fucked up. I didn't mean to, I thought I was being all conscientious and shit. And, I didn't meet your needs. Right. And so I feel remorse about that. And, it's like, I'm okay with feeling remorse, like, because I have a need for your well-being. So how can I meet that need?
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know if you feel comfortable with this, and it's all right if you don't. But would you be able to give us an example of one thing that you've noticed that, hey, you didn't meet the needs of your student and you're like, you felt bad, but you kind of switched it around once you found out about it?
Yeah. So I have a couple students who identify as non-binary. And I'm wired for binary, right? And so in some of, I've attempted and we've attempted the company has attempted, particularly spearheaded by my co-founder, Elena, who's very like adamant about, gender diversity and non-binary. So we've attempted to change languaging to make it all inclusive. So we've invested energy in this. And so we're getting a reflection from one of my non-binary students that actually, this doesn't meet my needs. Even, saying Yoni is binary for me, and it's not meeting my needs for choice about what I want to say about my own body, right? So that it's an invitation for even more sensitivity and even more inclusion. But the embarrassment is like, oh shit, I thought I was doing a good job.
Good job.
And like, I'm sorry that I didn't meet your needs. I feel so sad.
So what have you resolved this? Like how do you refer to the Yoni then?
Well, I mean, I think, again, that's a big discussion, because there's the outward, larger picture, right? It's like the reality for some people who are non-binary, the word yoni isn't offensive. For this particular person, it's not that it was offensive, but they had a need for, it still had too much coding in it for their comfort level, right? So, on the as far as a public platform, we can only go so far and be able to actually meet all the demographics that we want to meet. We don't specialize in non-binary tantra. We don't specialize. Yeah, that's not our specialty.
Right.
And we want to appeal to or include all expressions, diversity. That's actually because ultimately tantra, particularly 5-element tantra, it is for humans. It is how we heal the pain of humanity. And so I'm committed to making that accessible to fucking everybody the best way that we can. But privately, with this particular individual, when they communicated to me that certain words I used did not meet needs for them, and created a feeling of confinement, I changed my words with that individual. So I was like, okay, well, if this word isn't going to work, then I'm just going to say flesh.
Right.
Because that's what it is, right? I'm just going to take all program out of it, and we're going to go back to when we were 3 and we didn't know what anything was called, and we're just going to say, look at this flesh here, and look at that flesh there.
That sensitive flesh.
Yeah, that flesh there, right? That flesh has hair on it, right? Let's just, before we knew words for things. And that was actually the request. It was a request to find their own words and not have my words. And I heard that need for autonomy and that need for choice. So when we're working with people individually, it's really easy to meet that need to the depth that we can, as far as, how are we going to advertise, yoni massage without saying yoni? Well, I don't know that that's going to be a possibility, right? But if I'm teaching someone who feels triggered by the word yoni, then I just won't use that word. It's like, some people don't.
Context becomes important.
Context is important. Some people don't like the word pussy. So some people love the word pussy. I don't really like the word pussy. So if you're like, hey, pussy, 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 I'm going to be like, fuck off. I don't want to learn from you. Right.
Okay, so we kind of address when you are feeling that you wanted to cut pieces of your skin off, and that sort of body shame in terms of aesthetic and the beauty ideals. We talked about it in terms of some of the racial dynamics that came, and sort of what was put on you and how you came to sort of see yourself and the distortions there. How about in terms of sexual trauma, and how does that communicate with body shame?
Yeah. Wow. So something that I'm so excited to dig into this as I gain more knowledge about this, but I think that the issue of sexual trauma is and not just the overt sexual trauma that we experience from abuse, but the sexual trauma that we experience living in a culture that tries to pretend that we don't all have genitals and we're not all fucking, right? And that supports, unconscious pornography, and while at the same time censoring the word pleasure. I mean, it's literally insane. It is literally like a schizophrenic relationship with sexuality in this culture. So that is fucking traumatizing. It's confusing, right? And it's traumatizing, and there's no safe space, which means that there's no healing, there's no rest, there's no peace, which is traumatizing. So aside from that, I was going to say something else, but I remember what I was originally going to say. So bear with me, people. So something that I recently learned in Tibetan medicine is, so we have three levels of mind. We have the mind, we have the subtle mind, and we have the very subtle mind. So the very subtle mind carries all of our memories from all of our lifetimes. And it is also where we can access our Alaya consciousness, otherwise known as Akashic records, and our Buddha nature. And it's really hard to get in there, right? You can only get in there into the very subtle mind. It's it's locked up, and you can only get in there from years of meditation or near-death experiences or orgasm.
Hmm.
And the very subtle mind resides in your genitals, in your
Wow.
genital chakra.
Hmm.
So this, like when I read that, when I realized that, I was like, this is why sexual healing is so fucking essential. Because if we are carrying all of our traumas from past lifetimes in our genitals, and all of our memories and traumas from this lifetime in our genitals, like I don't want to carry the sexual abuse and trauma experience from this lifetime into my future lifetimes. I don't want them impacting the way I show up in the world sexually, because they're unhealed in this lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
So I just found that absolutely fascinating, that the storehouse for our infinite consciousness is in the genitals. And so
Mm.
when we experience sexual abuse and sexual trauma, it is going to imprint, it's going to affect not just this lifetime but potentially future lifetimes, and it's going to imprint and lock there. And how vital for those of us who as a society, but also those of us who have directly experienced sexual trauma, to find pathways to resolve that, to have resolution and healing, so
Mm.
that it actually is left in this lifetime and it is not a karmic wound that we carry forward.
Mm-hmm.
But to answer your original question
Mm.
about how sexual trauma is going to impact our self-image, well, it's trauma-based distortions. So, some people.
And maybe I'll just add that for me, it's not just self-image, but it's like even just how you feel in your body and how open you are or not, or like if there's trauma, there's body shame, like your body's gonna react in certain ways,
Well, it's damaged.
Yeah.
That's the thing. The physical body may or may not be damaged, but the energy body is damaged. So the
Mm-hmm.
channels are going to be blocked. They're going to be dense. The energy is going to stagnate. There's a direct correlation between childhood sexual trauma and cervical cancer, uterine cancer, sexual reproductive issues. The direct correlation.
Right.
So it causes illness. Unresolved trauma on any level, in any system, causes illness.
Yeah.
It's one of the root causes of illness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming to the end, but I don't know if you want to give one little anecdote that could be either from your life or someone that you know about that sexual shame piece.
You mean, what do you mean?
Like more of like a story, like someone's experience with something that you think would illustrate kind of like what you just talked about, because we talked a bit about theoretically, and I'm just curious if there's something that you could help us kind of like get into an anecdote or that sort of illustrates that well.
Yeah, so I'll tell you, I mean, for me, and this seems to be common. So when I first started training in sexual tantra, I first learned non-sexual 5-element practices, because you can't do it sexually if you don't know how to do it non-sexually. So my homework was to learn these shapes and symbols and sounds and masturbate and like work with my energy body. That was my homework. That was before I could like do it as a partner. I had to do it on my own. And I remember my mentor like gave me this wand, a G-spot wand, to like work with my inside my vagina. And I remember looking at it and I was terrified of it. I was like, and it's not even that big, but I was just like, I was horrified and I was terrified. And it's got two ends. It's got one with like a bulb on it that feels really nice, and then there's the other end that's supposed to be the handle, but you can turn it around and use it the other way, right? So I had to use it the other way, which is like a pinky. And I was terrified of putting anything in my vagina, because I believe, like, my whole imprint was that was a man's territory, that my clitoris was mine. I could play with my clitoris, but my vagina was for men.
Wow.
And
yeah,
it was for them. It was not for me. It was for man. It was for their pleasure. Again, it's not a conscious thing. It's a subconscious thing. And then when I'm confronted with having to put something in it, I was like, oh, well, I'm not allowed to put something in my own vagina. It doesn't belong to me. It belongs to my husband. Whoever that will be. So that, and also I will say, like, the disgust I felt at like having to touch my genitals and to put something in it. I was like, ew. And like, and I was afraid I was going to like break something. Like vaginas are resilient, but I was like, oh, what if I like puncture it, or but it was just, it was this discomfort, it was this ignorance, it was this conditioning that it didn't belong to me, it wasn't for my pleasure, it was for somebody else's pleasure. Right. And just this like this kind of squeamishness, just like, and it was subtle, it wasn't like overwhelming, but it was just kind of like yuck, like
and how did you resolve it? Like, how did you get through that? Like, just
I put lots of things in my vagina.
I'm sure there was some breathing involved too.
There was lots of breathing. There was lots of fingers and objects, and there was lots of time. I mean, and it wasn't like this ongoing pervasive thing. It cleared pretty quickly. It was like, oh, I'm really uncomfortable with this. This is interesting. And like, I'm just going to do it anyway, because this is my homework. And it very quickly purified out. Yeah, very quickly purified out. And another example that I'll give is in my training, my mentor was like, okay, so let's watch videos of women squirting, because I want you to see this. And I was disgusted. I was like, ew, I don't want to see pussy, like yuck, I don't want to see other yuck. I was just absolutely disgusted. I mean, but I did it because it was, my whatever, that was our training for the night, was to watch. But I remember initially feeling so disgusted at like watching pussy on the screen. I was just repelled by it, disgusted by it. And that purified pretty quickly too. Didn't take long for that to purify.
That's a really good point to name that too, that there are things that take layers and layers and layers of working through to like free yourself. And then there's some things, it's just like being aware of it, letting it go, and it's done. Yeah.
And that was a beautiful experience, because I remember watching this woman ejaculate, and what it triggered for me was a memory of when I was 24 and I was with that hippie dude growing weed, and I used to ejaculate with him when we had sex, and he yelled at me. And this one particular incident, I mean, it was, and we had no idea what it was. We were so ignorant. We had no idea, right? We thought I was peeing on him, and he'd get mad. He's like, God damn it, you pissed on me again. And I was just like, oh, well, it felt really good, right? Yeah. And then this one time, he literally shoved me off of him and screamed at me, you fucking nasty bitch. Yeah. And just like reamed me. Yeah. And that was at the age of 23, and I never had another orgasm until I was with a partner until I was 33, because I never allowed myself to relax into pleasure enough to get to the point where that might happen again. And again, it wasn't a conscious, I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to stop having orgasms. It was just, it was such a violent abuse. Like that ended up being like a 2-hour fucking fight. It was awful, right? It was so traumatizing that my body just shut down. And again, subconsciously, whenever I would have sex from that point, I would just stop. When I would get to a certain level of pleasure, I would just shut down. And it was not conscious. I didn't know that I was doing it. It was just, it was a shame. It was a trauma, shame-based trauma, right? Totally. He shamed me for my sexual expression. And so I stopped expressing myself sexually. 10 fucking years without an orgasm with a partner. And then my male partners would be like, well, you're broken because you can't have orgasms. Right? And so then they shamed me.
So it keeps on sort of compounding itself.
Yeah, self-perpetuating trauma, right? So
and the really interesting thing too is like today there's this, I mean, it's come to my awareness that, ejaculation for women is kind of like your lymph system kind of, detoxifying. And it's actually a really, really healthy thing for women to have. So it's like, it's amazing how words can shame an actual really natural process that your body uses to clean itself. And
exactly. And I call word curses. That's what I call them. And so that, I think that that's really important in the context of the greater like societal view of sexuality. If particularly, if women are told that their vaginas are stinky and they smell bad and they're gross and they're ugly and they're only for their partners to pummel as hard as they can, we are not consciously shutting down, but energetically, emotionally, subconsciously, we are shutting down. And so for many women that I've worked with, I mean, just peeling back those layers and examining how cultural conditioning has affected and infected in a
Yes,
bad way our relationship to our sexuality, that in and of itself is liberating. And when we have
absolutely.
liberation here, we have liberation here.
Exactly, exactly. I remember hearing some guys kind of, say the woman that actually self-pleasure means she can't get anything from men. So that was like a shameful thing that meant like,
Mm-hmm.
you weren't attractive enough or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it affected me. Like I was like, I couldn't, I was like, it was a barrier I had to get over myself. So I totally understand how ideas come into your head and then they stop blocking you out of like these very natural processes of your own body.
Exactly. And that's the thing about wounding and psychological trauma, is that it happens below the level of awareness. It's
Mm-hmm.
almost imperceptible until we, have the awareness to examine it.
Yeah.
So, to circle back to where we started this conversation, those messages I received from the time I was 6 years old about my I don't even know what the words are, my lack of value as
Mm-hmm.
a being because of my
Mm-hmm.
blackness. I mean, at that age, at 6 years old, you're just forming your concept of self. And my entire world at the time was feeding me this message that I was defective and deficient
Yeah.
because of my father, right?
Mm.
And you don't think to question as a child, because all these people in your environment are basically God.
Yeah,
they're
totally.
they're they're telling you the truth.
Yeah.
So that has been a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful victory and triumph to unwind a conditioning that has been all pervasive and so systemic within
Yeah.
internally and externally, and that
Yeah.
started so young. It's been a beautiful unraveling.
Yeah. Wow, this was such an enlightening and interesting conversation. I loved talking to you, and I always like really love being in your presence. You're explaining things. I really, really feel that teacher in you. You're like, it's like you just, explain things so well. So I'm glad
Thank
that
you.
everyone could hear you and get something from
Yes, and if you don't like the word fuck, you should plug your ears.
that. You didn't give us too many fucks today.
Yeah, I did. I was counting at least 21. I got to get
Oh, yeah.
21 in every interview.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And actually, maybe I'll just say for our next podcast next week, it's the leader of this movement called Unleash. She's this beautiful, exciting, full of joy woman as well, from originally from Puerto Rico. I met her in California. She just really impressed me with who she was and how she led things with such joy. So she's coming on the show next week to tell us about how she works with this concept of unleash, and it's a lot of movement and dancing and getting people to, unleash some of their programming in different ways. So um, it'll be an interesting conversation as well. But thanks, Devi, for taking time out from your beautiful Kelowna and
My
your
cannabis, my ganja plants.
exactly your sort of like farming mastery.
I'm growing weed, y'all. The Tantra thing doesn't work out. This is plan B.
All right. Like as if that's not going to work, right?
It's been working for 13 years, but I'm just saying, we like to joke about that. We'll be like 80-year-old pot farmers out here.
Well, love you lots, and it's always fun talking to you. And maybe we'll come up with other ideas of things we need to talk about.
Sounds good.
Big
All right,
hug
good
to
night,
you.
everyone.